Stories shape how we see the world. Voice of Witness is an award-winning oral history nonprofit harnessing the transformative power of storytelling. We work with individuals and communities impacted by injustice, helping them document their lived experiences through oral history, telling their own stories in their own words. In an era of reductive sound bites, we need this kind of nuanced grassroots storytelling to create a more just future. Visit voiceofwitness.org/learn to get involved, check out our workshops, and download tools to support your own project. Join us in building a more connected world, one story at a time.
Hi, I'm Rashmi Sajani, founder of Girls Who Code. Look, I'd consider myself a pretty successful adult woman. I've written books, founded 2 successful nonprofits, and I'm raising 2 incredible kids. But here's the thing. I still wake up wondering, is this it? And if the best years are yet to come, when's that going to start? Join me on My So-Called Midlife, my new podcast with Lemonada Media, where we're building a playbook for navigating midlife, one episode at a time. Each week, I'll chat with extraordinary guests who've transformed their midlife crisis into opportunities for growth and newfound purpose. At some point, we all ask ourselves, is there more to life? I'm here to discover how to thrive in my second act, right alongside you. My So-Called Midlife is out now, wherever you get your podcasts.
Lemonada.
Hello and welcome to Good Things. I'm your host, Maya Rupert. When it comes to youth and youth crime, there's a lot of misinformation. Like, locking kids up makes communities safer. If you do the crime, you should do the time. Or, some kids are just born bad, and their families and their environments are bad influences. Our guest today, Nate Balis, is here to dispel those misconceptions. Nate is the director of the Juvenile Justice Strategy Group at the Annie E. Casey Foundation. He'll talk about reframing how we think about youth crime, the injustices of the juvenile justice system, and the need for effective solutions that actually promote community safety. Nate, welcome to Good Things.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
I'm really excited to have this conversation today. But first, I want to take that term, youth crime, and talk about that. Because usually it's not as sinister as that sort of phrase could make it sound.
Right.
What kind of things are young people getting in trouble for?
Yeah, I love how you asked that, because I think that's one of the big misconceptions. If we look at the most recent data, just to give a sense of what's happening in terms of the volume of this, we find that the most common offense for which youth are arrested and referred to court is simple assault. So what does that mean? Simple assault is fights, right? Getting in fights, right, or other assaults that don't involve weapons. This is actually a quarter of all cases that come to juvenile court. And after that, when we're looking at the most common offenses, we're talking about things like theft, like shoplifting, vandalism and trespassing, right, disorderly conduct, drug violations. So you may be wondering, what about the offenses that get the most attention? The ones, right, that we hear about, right, on the news. Those happen too. They're much, much less common. Felony, right, person offenses like homicide or rape, robbery, aggravated assault, really awful, scary things. That's 10% of all cases that come in. Right. Burglary and motor vehicle theft, they total 7% of all cases that come in. Weapons offenses, another 3%. Understandably, these are things that get a lot of attention because they concern us the most, but they're not a good representation of what gets kids in trouble, like where your question started.
That is interesting then, because if we just talk about it broadly, you can hear something like youth crime is on the rise, but you're not getting that granular picture that you're talking about.
Right. And I think that's really important to understand when we talk about, is crime up, is crime down? What's really important is asking, what are we talking about specifically with, right, young people?
Right. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about your own upbringing. I'm in DC. You grew up in the suburbs of Washington, DC in the early 90s.
Yes.
That's where you were a teenager.
Yeah.
What was that experience like?
You know, I've thought about this a lot because that was the time when I was in high school. And I know now, looking backwards, that was also the peak of juvenile crime in this country, the peak of juvenile arrests, the start of the super predator myth, the debunked myth that kids were going to get worse and worse and that crime was going to go up and up. And yet I was living in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and you'd never know it. There's nothing about my experience that told me that this was the peak of juvenile crime. We had contact with police, but for me and my friends, we were told that the police were there to keep us safe, and we felt that. And we weren't really concerned with police in our lives. We were just concerned about getting caught doing the things that like kids might do. And so I think, you know, if you were thinking about my own experience as a kid, the most common offenses were the things that were most common around the juvenile court referrals that I just told you about. And this was true of kids in my high school, and this is true around my college-bound peers. So fights, alcohol and drugs, theft. I'm not sure any of us were proud of these moments, right? When we look back as being a teenager, but they were a pretty normal part of the high school experience in my high school, where almost everyone graduated and almost everyone went to college. These behaviors rarely put us in contact with police, and certainly not with the courts.
Right. So let's talk about that for a minute, because I think what you're describing is a reality that we really do know about young people. And that's that young people, kids, make mistakes. They take risks. They test boundaries. That's kind of the point. We understand that that's what adolescence is, right? So what do we know about the human brain? And why is that important when we're thinking about solutions to youth crime?
Yeah, it's a great question, Maya, because, you know, on the one hand, most of what we know about the adolescent brain is due to a tremendous amount of really important research over the last few decades. But we've known that young people are different than adults for a long time. It didn't require neuroscience and developmental psychology to know that teenagers are a different breed, right? We understand this intuitively about the teenagers in our own life, and we all remember being a teenager and going through puberty and all of the things and our emotions being at this intense level. So like, this is not something that requires a scientist to tell us that something different's happening, but it's really helpful, right? It's really helpful to understand. So I am not a neuroscientist. I'm not a developmental psychologist. So I'll do my best to summarize what I've learned over time. But what we know is during adolescence, the brain is still developing. The front of our brain is the prefrontal cortex. That's the last part of the brain to develop. And it's not fully developed until we're in our mid-20s. So why does that matter? So the prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that regulates our emotions and impulses. It helps us think about the future. It helps us make rational decisions and adapt to change. It helps us think critically and rationalize for steady decision making. And it helps us exercise empathy. Now, when this part of the brain is still under development, right, what do we find about youth and young adults? Less able to control impulses, less able to resist pressure from peers, less likely to think ahead, more driven by the thrill of rewards. And this is why when we ask a teenager, and I have one of my own right now, when you wonder, like, why did they just do the thing that they just did? Sometimes the response is, I don't know. And they don't know. They don't know. I mean, as it's been explained to me, as I've heard from different adolescent brain researchers, adolescents are like a car with a bad braking system, right? They know, they can see things happening, but they're really, really bad at braking. And I think as it relates to delinquency, it's just important to remember that immature adolescents almost always grow into mature, law-abiding adults. The worst thing we can do is delay the developmental process by denying young people new experiences and ideas or introducing new traumas. So when we think about that stage of our life, when I look back at being in high school and then those years in college, you're remembering all these wonderful things. And when you're thinking about it, you're meeting new people. You've been introduced to new concepts. You see new things. And this is exactly what helps us grow. If we take young people who are making mistakes and we lock them down and we control those experiences, we limit what they see, it's really the opposite of what we want to do if we want to help people grow and become productive adults.
So I think what you're describing, I think, illustrates so much of what the problem we're seeing is, which is you're describing basically this period of time where, you know, being a young person, taking these kinds of risks, making mistakes is part of the process. The way you grew up, the way your peers grew up, you went through that, but you weren't having these interactions with cops. You weren't then sort of treated like this stage is where you're going to be forever. But we know that that's not true for all kids.
That's right.
So can we talk a little bit about that and more, you know, how disparities come out in that way? How does race play out in the way that those kind of youthful mistakes are treated and then maybe people are given the freedom to grow from them or not?
Sure. And I think is a really important question because I personally, after spending now over 2 decades working in the youth justice space, I think it's impossible for any of us who work in the space to talk about this work, talk about what's going on in juvenile justice, what we would like to see go on in juvenile justice, and not talk about race because race plays such an outsized role.
Right.
A young person's race and where they live have a huge impact on their experience with the juvenile justice system. And race and place for a young person are 2 things that they cannot change.
Right.
It's not up to them. They are who they are and they're from where they're from. Kids don't get to decide that. And so when we do things that treat kids differently because of what they look like or where they're from, that on its face is deeply unfair. And as we were just talking about the adolescent brain and we were just talking about teenagers, as we know, nothing is worse to a teenager than something being unfair.
Right.
When something's unfair, it's not legitimate. And that's a huge, huge issue. So I think it's really important to set that up and then talk about what do we see. So, you know, compared to their white peers, Black youth are more likely to be arrested and referred to court. When they're arrested, Black youth are more likely to be detained in a local detention center, like the kid equivalent to a jail, and they stay longer once they're detained. They're more likely to be placed in a correctional facility or other residential program when they're sentenced in court. And they're more likely to be charged as an adult instead of having their case heard in juvenile court. Those disparities that I'm describing exist after we factor in offense. So in other words, Black youth with a violent offense are more likely than their white peers with violent offenses to be detained. Right. Black youth with a property offense are more likely than their white peers with property offenses to be detained, and so on. On top of that, youth from different parts of the country, from different parts of their state, or even different parts of their county or city that they live in, can have vastly different likelihoods of being arrested, even for the types of offenses that are most common among adolescents. Again, shoplifting, fighting, or drugs. You said you're in D.C. I worked in the system in Washington, D.C., and we could see this in our data all of the time. I was the research manager in the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services. While I was there, we didn't have white kids in our system, period. We did not have white kids in detention. We did not have white kids in our correctional facility.
Wow.
So when kids have different experiences based on where they live, we can often call that justice by geography. So what can be especially striking is when we combine the 2 things, again, 2 factors that a young person can't impact themselves. They can't change what they look like. They can't change where they live. And yet they have a huge outsized impact on how young people experience the justice system.
We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back with more on Good Things.
Interested in the power of first-person storytelling? The Voice of Witness book series documents the oral histories of people directly impacted by and fighting against injustice. Each collection supports historically excluded communities to tell their own stories in their own words. The books feature a diversity of voices, including those of refugees and immigrants, incarcerated people, communities displaced from public housing, farm workers, indigenous peoples, and more. These powerful stories highlight crucial issues and expose the impacts of harmful narratives and policies, laying the groundwork to build solidarity and movements for change. Voice of Witness books are read and used by thousands of educators, organizations, and advocates across the country each year. Visit voiceofwitness.org/read to learn more, access free resources, and get involved.
Want a sneak preview of hot new audiobooks? Then check out Your Next Listen, a new podcast from Lemonada Media and Simon & Schuster Audio. We've got everything: the hottest new thrillers, best-selling celebrity memoirs, and swoony romances. And these aren't tiny clips either. They're entire chapters you can listen to. Your Next Listen is out November 11th, wherever you get your podcasts.
Let's talk about the data and the numbers. You have 2 decades of experience in this. You're steeped in it.
Yes.
What most of us, I think, hear is just from news reports. And there's always this sense of youth crime is on the rise. It's growing. Is that true? And what does it actually mean?
Yes, the $1 million question, right? So, I mean, first, let me start by saying, when we're talking about crime, a couple things, and I promise I'm not punning on the question. I just think it's important to set up. The first thing is everyone deserves to work, play, raise their children in safety. And when people don't feel safe, we know it's really hard to focus on anything else.
Absolutely.
And so when these questions come up about crime, with all the things I just talked about the adolescent brain, and about disparities, and about all this, people will shut down and not be able to even hear that if they feel like they aren't safe. So I think it's really important. And it's also important to understand that the safest places in our country don't have more police, more prisons, and harsher sentences. They have access to jobs and economic prosperity. They have good schools. There's housing and healthcare. There's good infrastructure. And there's trust between community and police. And that's the kind of hope we all want. So I say all that just to say, irrespective of what's going on with crime, understand this. But I want to get into your question because I think it's a really important one. So let me start by saying that we're always working with imperfect data when we talk about youth crime being up or down. But if we use the best data we have nationally, what we know is that referrals to juvenile court are way, way down if we zoom out and look over the decades. So the most recent national data we have is from 2022. There were about 550,000 referrals to juvenile court. That sounds like a lot of referrals to juvenile court around the country in 2022.
Yeah.
But in 1997, it was more than 1.8 million.
Wow.
So that's a 70% decrease over that 25-year period. If we zoom in a little bit, though, say, okay, that's 25 years ago. Do we care about 25 years? So let's just look at the last decade. We still find a 45% decline.
Okay.
Let's look back 5 years then instead of 10 years. We see a 25% decline. It's only when we look in the more short term that when we look at the change in those data from 2021 to 2022 that we see an increase. But that largely accounts for the historic lows in juvenile arrest that happened during the pandemic. So it's something to be a little bit of, take with a little bit grain of salt. However, what's important is this might differ from state to state. It might differ from local jurisdiction to local jurisdiction. It can also differ by offense. So arrests may be down generally, but for some specific crimes, it might be up. So I just want to make a few points about this. One is that I think the big picture of juvenile arrests being down so much over the decades is something that should be celebrated, and yet it's really not understood by the general public.
Right.
I think there is always a sense in each generation as they reach adolescence that young people today are doing worse.
Yes.
Right? Yes.
It's
like kids these days.
It's such a cliche, right?
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. Kids these days has been a common refrain for as long as there's been teenagers driving their parents crazy, right? I mean, that's just how it is. And while kids face all kinds of challenges today and maybe doing worse in some key areas than previous generations, delinquent behavior is not one of them. It's just not, right? Young people are far, far less likely than when I was a teenager, as we were talking about in the early 1990s, to be arrested for all kinds of offenses. The second point I want to make is that young people are responsible for a small portion of crime. And most of that, as I pointed out earlier, is for relatively minor offenses. So as one of my colleagues at the Casey Foundation always reminds me, the vast majority of crime is not youth crime. And the vast majority of youth crime is not violent crime. It's really important to get that. So I'm just going to say it one more time. The vast majority of crime is not youth crime, and the vast majority of youth crime is not violent crime. And the last thing I want to say with those 2 points is that neither of those things matter much, either the trends or the relatively small percentage of crime and serious crime committed by kids, when someone has been victimized. Even if crime is down overall, it's bad when kids commit crimes, especially those that harm people. It's bad for the victim, it's bad for the community, and for the young people and their family. So all this information is really, really important, right? But to me, what's especially important then is that we do what we can to prevent young people from getting involved in the juvenile justice system, and that when they do break the law, or even if they do harm to others, that we respond in ways that are effective at keeping them from reoffending again.
Right.
We want to see them on a pathway to success, not to deeper involvement in the justice system, future offending, and ultimately being involved in the adult criminal justice system.
Right. So that is so helpful. And that context, I think, is incredibly important. But I think you make a good point that all of the data pales in comparison to the feeling. Like so many times,
Yes.
What we're really talking about is, do people feel safe? Which is a much harder conversation to have.
Yes.
But let's talk then about those instances of the more serious offenses. And to your point, how do we both address the issue of serious offenses when they do come up, but do it in a way that does not mean these young people are now going to get funneled into a system that we know is going to make it more likely to reoffend, and therefore that feeling of unsafety to continue,
Yes.
right?
Yes. So a lot of things to say about that. I have a shirt with a quote from Brian Stevenson that says, "Each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done." And one of the things that I think is really important in thinking about young people is that they can make mistakes, they can do things that are really harmful, and those things should not define who those kids are.
Right.
And I think why I start there is because that is just so intuitive when it comes to the people in our own lives.
Of course.
They can make any number of mistakes, and they could do something that was really bad, and it wouldn't change what we think about them. It wouldn't change the fact that we still love them and we still want the best for them. And so I say that because when we think about the people we care about, if you think about a young person in your life who you care about, and we imagine what they're doing as a teenager, I think we're imagining the good things that we'd want from them as a teenager, and we imagine the healthy things. And yeah, we'd imagine them taking certain risks, but we wouldn't imagine them in a jail.
Right.
We wouldn't imagine them in a prison. And I think that it's understandable that when we're fearful, that we want to respond by saying, get this person out of the way. Put them somewhere where I don't have to see them. And that's the instinct I think we have oftentimes to lock kids up. But what happens when we lock kids up? So let's just actually talk about that. There's local detention centers. And this is where we put them when they've just been accused of a crime. What does that look like? Well, they're not in school, right? They're not in their community with their friends. They're not with their families.
Right.
And we might say, well, but they were getting in trouble when they were in their community. They were getting in trouble when those things happened. But what happens when they get out? Well, what do we know? When young people are released from detention, we know that they are far less likely than other kids to remain in school. In some places, the odds that they'll ever go back to school or they'll ever graduate go down considerably. We know that. We know that they're less likely then to be employed. We know that those are kids who are more likely to use drugs. And maybe most of all, young people who are locked up are far more likely to continue getting rearrested and end up in the adult system. If we think about removing kids from their home and sticking them in a jail, these are not kids who we're giving a message to that you're going to be successful.
Right.
These are kids who we're basically telling, we expect the worst from you. And so while it might be, again, understandable that we think we need to keep a kid out of the community for some short period of time, there are real collateral consequences when we do that. And there's just a lot of things that I think we can do differently for young people.
Can we talk about that? Like, what would the alternative be? Because I think you're right. I think the problem with the punitive nature of our system, it's we have to take them out of their community, out of their family. We have to put them away. What is the alternative to that model?
Well, there's a lot of things. And the biggest is that there's not one answer, because every kid is different and every kid has different needs and every kid has different strengths. When young people are put on probation, which is the most common thing that's going to happen if it's a serious offense and they're not going to be locked up. But what is probation? Well, oftentimes probation is just a list of rules that kids are supposed to follow, conditions that keep them in the community and out of jail, basically. But that's not really what we want. What we want is a kind of individualized approach for each young person, a case plan that's done in partnership with their family so that their families are partners in what we're doing. So we like to call that family engaged case planning, that we use that same adolescent brain research that tells us that young people especially, all people, but young people especially, respond much, much better to incentives than to sanctions.
Right.
And this is really the opposite of oftentimes how we work with young people in the community. We say, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And if you do, you'll face this punishment. What we know from young people, and again, this is somewhat intuitive if you have young people in your own life, that when we offer the carrot is when young people really succeed. Even small rewards that we give young people can keep them on the right path and towards something else. Right. We want to give young people opportunities to do things that they care about. A lot of young people haven't had opportunities to be exposed to the sort of positive things they want to do, whether that's in sports, whether that's in arts, whether that's in music. Young people want money. I mean, think back to when you were a kid. Every kid wants cash in their pocket, right? And young people are willing to work for that. So they need jobs. They need jobs that pay, and not just jobs, but things that can help them build towards a career. So they need those things. They also need help with how they react, right? So we have a really good track record for approaches that focus on cognitive behavioral therapy, right? That help kids in the moment be able to respond better with how they feel, how they think, how they act. Right. To have different tools that help them sort of break a cycle that gets them down a bad path. We know lots of kids have a lot of anger and they need the ability to disrupt that. So there's lots of things. It's not just one. I worked with somebody in this field for a long time who liked to talk about young people and the approaches we have with them. He said, like, I like to think about this like a janitor, an old school janitor with that big key ring. You know, he's got the key ring with like 100 keys on it. Right. And he's like, somehow he knows the key that goes into that. And it's like every kid has a key and they're all totally different. Each kid's different. You know, they all are going to need a different approach, but we have to believe that each kid is someone who is deserving of a brighter future and deserving of our time to really work towards that, to try to figure it out, what's going to help him or her succeed. What we know really matters, though, is that accountability for all of us, accountability comes from relationships, not from rules. It's not enough to just say you're going to jail for a certain amount of time and say that's how we're holding you accountable. That doesn't mean that the person has ever acknowledged what they've done, that they've acknowledged the harm of what they've done, They haven't committed to doing anything differently. What we know is we need people who are credible with young people. We hear a lot about credible messengers. And really what that means is who can reach a young person and hold them accountable because they believe in them. I mean, that's what we need. And on top of that, I guess the last things I started going down that path is restorative justice. Approaches that, again, are aiming at actually helping resolve the conflict as opposed to just punishing a young person. Accountability has to mean taking responsibility. And taking responsibility to the victim is critical, not just for this young person's success, but to give closure to victims of crime as well.
Okay, hold tight, everyone. We're going to take one more quick break, and we'll be back with more good things.
Hi, I'm Emily Deschanel.
And I'm Carla Gallo, and we're excited to tell you about Boneheads, our new Bones rewatch podcast.
I played Dr. Temperance Brennan.
And I played Daisy Wick, and we are going to watch from the very beginning.
We're going to watch the episodes. We're going to reminisce. We're going to laugh. We're going to cry. We're going to tell behind-the-scenes stories.
We're going to go on tangents.
A lot of tangents.
So whether you're a seasoned Bones fanatic or a newcomer looking to dip your toes into the wild world of forensic anthropology, this show is for you.
Boneheads from Lemonada Media is out now wherever you get your podcasts.
Want more from your favorite Lemonada Media podcasts while supporting the shows that help make life suck less? Subscribe to Lemonada Premium today. As a subscriber, you'll unlock exclusive bonus content like never-before-heard interviews, behind-the-scenes moments, bonus episodes, and so much more. It's easy to sign up no matter what podcast app you use. On Apple, you can just click the Lemonada logo in the Apple Podcast app and hit subscribe. For all other podcast apps, head to lemonada.supportingcast.fm to subscribe. That's lemonada.supportingcast.fm.
Do you have any stories or anecdotes from the time you've been working, or even things you've heard from other people about, processes that have worked or that can further illustrate what you're saying, that the sort of myth of sending people away, that will fix things for them, that it will make a community better off?
I've known a lot of young people over the years who've experienced the system. And when they point to what really mattered, ultimately, we can have all the evidence about what matters and look at programs, but they could always point to, there was an adult in my corner who sought to understand me.
Right.
Someone who reached me. Maybe I had 2 probation officers before that all I felt like they were trying to do was catch me do something wrong and punish me. And then I found that person who was really hoping to help me do right. And that was the person who reached me. It wasn't one thing, right? But it was having someone in my corner, having adults who believed in me, having opportunities to do things that I cared about, that those were important. And yes, having therapies that help kids think differently. The flip of it is we know a lot of young people who've experienced some of the worst things in the juvenile justice system, and they may come out the other end and be doing well. And what they usually point to is, I'm doing well in spite of what I experienced. I was just at an event this week in our state here in Maryland where we were talking about young people being charged as adults. And there was a young woman who was on a panel who had herself been put both in the adult system for something that was an absurd reason of being charged as an adult. And then ultimately her case was moved down to juvenile court. And while we were on the panel, she had to use the restroom. And we were specifically having this meeting at an old corrections facility, at a part that was a little different. It was a building that was outside of the secure part, but it still had a very correctional feel. And she got up and she went to the bathroom and she came back. And when I asked her a question, she said, it's been 15 years since I experienced the juvenile justice system. And I just went to the bathroom and I saw a shower in that bathroom and it immediately brought it all back.
Wow.
that 15 years later, I'm still haunted by these experiences that I've had. And we've seen that of young people where it's very difficult to even think about going back into a detention center to see what's going on. So I think that, we haven't even talked a lot about trauma, of the trauma that young people experience before coming into the juvenile justice system. And unfortunately, young people who've already experienced a ton of trauma in their lives, who've been exposed to violence, they may have been exposed to challenges in their families. And then we put them in a system that exerts more trauma upon them. And so it's really important to think about.
Wow. Yeah. That's an incredibly powerful and just visceral story, because it really makes you realize how many stories like that people who have been in that situation have to have. And that is a really difficult thing to sit with.
And that's what's so alarming, is because having had the experience, the privilege really, to meet so many young people who've come out the other side of the juvenile justice system, and understanding that each of them was so much more than the offenses that they committed. It was so much more. They were young people full of promise who had made mistakes. And again, some who had done things that harmed other people. And yet getting to see them as a 24-year-old on the other side of it and realize that these are people who are so worthy of our belief that they can be more than what the juvenile justice system might have had in mind for them. And I really believe that. Like, one thing that I really admire about people who work in youth justice is that they believe that the young people who they're with can change. They believe that they're deserving of a brighter future. And I think there's too many parts of our society that would rather just ignore these young people and see them undeserving of empathy and undeserving of that brighter future. But we know the opposite is true.
Right. So then let's sort of move to how we kind of start building the system that we need to see. Obviously, the goal is fewer people in youth detention, fewer people who are getting involved in the justice system as young people, and more of these community-based practices that are more tailored to an individual solution. But in order to get there, we need to build the pathways, but we also need to change the mindset you're describing, right? That the idea of a future is something you have to deserve at all. How do we shift so that people can see who someone is as a young person isn't who they're going to be at 24 and 25? How do we shift that mindset?
I think one of the things we need to do is we need to hold our leaders accountable for being smart on safety rather than being tough on crime. We just know far too much about what works and what doesn't work to let them off the hook for policies and practices that sound tough but make us less safe.
Right.
I think that's just, it's a really important thing.
Right.
What else can people do? Support a local program or volunteer in one that specifically aims to work with young people who have been involved in the system. That's really important. So, celebrate our young people rather than demonize them. Listen to what youth are telling us about what they need to feel safe and feel valued. Lots of young people don't feel safe through no fault of their own. And we need to be able to hear them about what they need as well. Overall, I think, there's a way of having this conversation and it's sounding super negative, but I'm very positive about what kids are doing. I feel good about kids. Kids are dealing with a lot. And yet when it comes to crime, again, I can know, because I'm looking at the data, that kids are doing better today than certainly they were when I was a kid. So I can feel good about that. But I also can feel good that our juvenile justice systems, they have more knowledge than they've ever had before. And there are so many good things that are happening out there. We're way more likely to be supporting credible messengers who themselves experience the justice system, who've come home and who want to help our young people. We have way more places that are having better practices of what they're doing with young people in the system. The people leading these agencies, leading the public systems, people working in communities, they know more about what works to help young people And it's really about making sure that they're implementing that, making sure that they're resourced to do that, and really about having the kinds of community partnerships that really support young people in the places that they live.
This was an incredibly powerful conversation, and I'm really grateful for you having it. And I'm so, so grateful for the work that you and your colleagues are doing. We need people speaking up for young people, and I'm glad you're doing it. So thank you.
Thank you, Maya. I appreciate it.
This episode was made possible with support from the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Learn more at aecf.org. Views expressed in this episode are solely those of the participants. Next week, we'll keep talking about reshaping our thinking and approach to youth crime and take a deep look at transforming juvenile probation. Thanks so much for listening. I'm your host, Maya Rupert. This series is produced by Lisa Fu and Hannah Boomershine. Our supervising producer is Muna Danish. Mixing and sound design by Noah Smith. Jackie Danziger is our VP of Partnerships and Production. Production support for Maggie Kraushaar. Executive producers are Stephanie Whittles-Wax and Jessica Cordova-Kramer. Help others find our show by leaving us a rating or writing a review. Follow Good Things wherever you get your podcasts and listen ad-free on Amazon Music with your Prime membership. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next week.
Are you looking for ways to make your everyday life happier, healthier, more productive, and more creative? I'm Gretchen Rubin, the #1 best-selling author of The Happiness Project, bringing you fresh insights and practical solutions in the Happier with Gretchen Rubin podcast. My co-host and happiness guinea pig is my sister, Elizabeth Kraft.
That's me, Elizabeth Kraft, a TV writer and producer in Hollywood. Join us as we explore ideas and hacks about cultivating happiness and good habits.
Check out Happier with Gretchen Rubin from Lemonada Media.
Hi, everyone. Gloria Riviera here, and we are back for another season of No One Is Coming to Save Us, a podcast about America's childcare crisis. This season, we're delving deep into 5 critical issues facing our country through the lens of childcare: poverty, mental health, housing, climate change, and the public school system. By exploring these connections, we aim to highlight that childcare is not an isolated issue, but one that influences all facets of American life. Season 4 of No One Is Coming to Save Us is out now wherever you get your podcasts.